Our film premieres in 1986. Clarice Starling, a 25-year-old FBI trainee, runs through the woods on her daily training program at Quantico. She's pulled from her regiment by Jack Crawford of the Bureau of Behavioral Science Unit, and he greets her and recalls their first meeting when she was a student of his. And he presents her with an errand, a very special errand. He assigns her to interview the notorious Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a brilliant forensic psychiatrist, an incarcerated cannibalistic serial killer, on the pretense of persuading Lecter to answer a questionnaire about himself for the Bureau's psychological profiles. But they have a hidden agenda, and that agenda is gaining Lecter's insights about the psychopathic serial killer named Buffalo Bill, who murders young women and removes their skin from their bodies. After learning the assignment, Crawford wants Starling to observe and question Lecter, but he warns her not to give him any personal information, warning her that she does not want Hannibal Lecter inside her head. I mean, after all, he is some kind of therapist, and he can really screw with you. And Crawford reminds her not to forget who Lecter is, and Starling queries as to what he means, and this question is answered to her by Dr. Frederick Chilton, who tells her that, oh, he's a monster, a pure psychopath. And Dr. Frederick is the head of the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. He's like the warden for the loony bin. And at this facility, they call Dr. Hannibal Hannibal the Cannibal. And after making several awkward, flirtatious comments to Starling, Dr. Frederick takes her to see Lecter. And Chilton goes through the extreme security measures that they use when handling Lecter. And he describes that he once brutally attacked and ate a nurse's tongue at the hospital when security was more relaxed. And the guard, Barney, warmly greets Clarice and directs her to Lecter's cell. While unnerved by the very disturbing inmates, especially Miggs, who hisses obscenities at her, she makes her way to Dr. Lecter's cell at the end of the hall. And Dr. Lecter is quite the opposite than the other inmates. He stands in the middle of his cell, which has a bulletproof wall instead of bars, and he greets her very politely. And Starling introduces herself, and they have a brief conversation about Buffalo Bill. And at Lecter's request, Starling reveals that Bill has killed and skinned at least 5 women and received his nickname from the tasteless joke made by the Kansas City Homicide Department. And although initially pleasant and courteous, Lecter is unimpressed with the questionnaire that she presented him with, and he grows impatient with Starling's attempt at dissecting him, and he viciously rebuffs her. He gives her an accurate yet unflattering cold reading based on her appearance and demeanor. Shocked, Starling responds that Lecter should look at himself with that kind of accuracy, and taunts Lecter that maybe he's too afraid to do so. And Lecter dismisses her, giving her a gruesome description of how a census taker once tried to test him, and he ended up eating his liver with some fava beans and some nice Chianti. And to unnerve her even more, he makes this incredibly disturbing slurping sound. It kind of sounded like this. Come on, I probably ruined it, but it was just like that, and it was so creepy. And as Starling departs, Lecter's neighbor Miggs flings his own semen at her face, enraging Lecter, who calls Starling back and offers her some information containing details about a former patient, Miss Hester Moffat. And later that night, Lecter decides to kill Miggs by persuading him to swallow his own tongue. And the name Hester Moffat is actually an anagram, Miss the Rest of Me, that leads to a storage lot where Starling discovered a decapitated head in a jar. Starling returns to Lecter, and he identifies the head as Benjamin Raspel, a former patient of his. And Lecter insists that he did not kill Raspel, merely stored his head in the garage. And Raspel was Lecter's patient who suffered from manic depression. From the women's clothing found in the garage and Lecter's remark about a killer's previous efforts, Starling believes that Buffalo Bill killed Raspel and that Lecter knows his identity. And Lecter offers a psychological profile of the killer in exchange for better facilities, where he has an open window so he can see the trees, and also where he can be as far away from Dr. Chilton as possible. And miles away, Buffalo Bill abducts Catherine Martin, the daughter of a United States Senator, Ruth Martin. And Bill abducts her by pretending to be injured and asking her to help him lift a sofa into his van. And then he beats her up with his arm cast, and she ends up waking up in a well that he has in his house. That's a red flag, right? If somebody has a well in the middle of their house, yeah, always bad. And Bill taunts Martin and demands that she put on lotion on her skin while she pleads for her life. And when she realizes who he is, she screams in horror. because she'd heard about him all over the news. It's never you until it is, right? You hear that something horrible is happening, you're like, meh, that's horrible. But when it's you, you're like, oh my god, this is horrible. Moving on, Starling is pulled from Quantico and accompanies Crawford to West Virginia. And there they find the body of Bill's recently discovered victim, and Starling helps perform an autopsy. And inside the victim's throat, they find a chrysalis of a moth. And a chrysalis is like a pupa of a moth, like an undeveloped moth. Sort of, yeah. They later find the same type of moth in Rasplin's throat, confirming that he's a victim of Buffalo Bill. And at Quantico, as news of Catherine Martin's abduction sweeps the country, Crawford authorizes Starling to offer Hannibal Lecter a fake deal promising a prison transfer if he provides information that helps profile Buffalo Bill and rescue Catherine Martin. Seemingly unimpressed with the deal, Lecter instead begins a game of quid pro quo with Starling, offering comprehensive clues and insight about Buffalo Bill in exchange for events from Starling's traumatic childhood. And Starling, ignoring Crawford's warnings about not giving him any personal information, reveals that at the age of 10, her father was murdered by 2 armed robbers, and then they moved out to a ranch to live with relatives. And for that piece of information, Lecter explains the Buffalo Bill is under this delusion that he is a woman, and that he visits various types of clinics to get some kind of gender reassignment surgery. And unaware to both Starling and Lecter, Dr. Chilton was apparently recording their conversation. And later on, Lecter is restrained in his cell, and Chilton mocks him. He smugly says that Starling's deal was actually a sham, but he offers him a transfer in exchange for a deal of his own making. And Lecter agrees to this, but wants a deal of his own. And he also reveals that Buffalo Bill's name is actually Lewis, but he will tell the rest of the information that he has to Senator Martin herself in Tennessee. And Lecter notices that Chilton has left his golden ballpoint pen in his cell after their very exciting conversation. Lecter is flown to Tennessee under the highest security possible, and after being taken off the plane, Chilton introduces Senator Martin to Lecter, and Lecter describes Buffalo Bill, saying that his real name is Lewis Friend. He was introduced to Lecter by Raspel, and he found out that Lewis was killing people back then and skinning them. And Lecter then causes an extreme offense to Martin by taunting her about Catherine. I mean, of course he does, he's a lunatic. And Martin furiously demands that Lecter be taken back to Baltimore, but Lecter gives a physical description of Lewis Friend. And as the manhunt begins, Starling travels to Lecter's special cell in a local Tennessee courthouse, where she confronts him about the false information that he gave the senator. And Lecter mocks Starling's attempts at fooling him. However, he gives her further information on how to catch Buffalo Bill, quoting Marcus Aurelius on coveting the things that we see first. And Lecter refuses Starling's pleas of stopping the game and demands that she finishes her story surrounding her worst childhood memory. And she goes on to talk about her arrival at the relative's farm and the horror of discovering their lamb slaughterhouse and her fruitless attempts at rescuing the lambs. Starling cheerfully recalls that she tried to save one lamb, and as she was trying to escape, she gets caught and she gets sent back to the orphanage. And Lecter emotionally thanks her for sharing the memory, and she leaves with her case file before she's escorted out of the building by security guards. And later that evening, Lecter demands an extra meal of extra rare lamb chops, much to the annoyance of his guards. And as they were trying to get him his lamb chops, Dr. Lecter escapes from his cell using an improvised handcuff key made from Chilton's pen, and he brutally attacks his guards, and he bites one on the face, and he knocks him unconscious, and he handcuffs the other one to the bars, and he beats him to death. And then Lecter picks up one of the guards' pocket knives, and he walks out. And several hours later, shots are heard in the building, prompting the local police to storm the floor. And when they get there, the scene is like something out of Carnage, discovering that one guard is still alive and his face horribly mutilated, and the other guard is disemboweled and strung up on the walls of the cage. And paramedics transport the guard in an ambulance to speed off, while a SWAT team searches the building for Lecter. And on one floor, they see the elevator shaft doors open, and the officers find Lecter with a gun by his side and copious amounts of blood pouring from his head, seeming like he almost tried to off himself. And one guard shoots him in the leg as a warning, and at the same time, the ambulance guards discover blood dripping from the elevator ceiling. And apparently, this is not really Lecter. And meanwhile, as the paramedics were giving information about the guard to the hospital, the guard sits up and removes his own mutilated face, revealing himself to be Lecter. Apparently, Lecter cut up the face of the guard and put it on as his own face and put on his clothes so that the SWAT team and everybody else mistakes him to be the guard instead of Lecter. It's a pretty interesting trick. And amidst all the chaos and all the excitement and all the fear, they actually didn't think twice about checking, and apparently it's Lecter. And you can assume that he killed everybody in that ambulance. And after being notified of Lecter's escape and that he killed the paramedics and a tourist, Starling pores over his case file, analyzing Lecter's annotations before realizing that the first victim Frederica Bimmel, that Lecter killed, knew Buffalo Bill in real life before Lecter killed her. And Starling travels to Bimmel's hometown and discovers that Bimmel was a tailor and has dresses with templates identical to the patches of skin removed from Buffalo Bill's victims. And from this, she realizes that Buffalo Bill is a tailor fashioning a woman's suit of real skin. And she telephones Crawford, who's already on his way to make an arrest, having cross-referenced Lecter's notes with Johns Hopkins Hospital and finding a man named Jamie Gum. And Crawford instructs Starling to continue interviewing Bimmel's friends while he leads a SWAT team to Gum's business address in Clermont City, Illinois. And at Gum's house, Martin lures Gum's beloved dog, Precious, into the well. When Gum finds that Martin is holding his dog hostage, he becomes really enraged and devastated, and he threatens to kill her. I mean, he was gonna kill her anyways and skin her, but this time he's like really pissed off. And Starling's interview leads to the house of Jack Gordon. And after a pleasant talk, Starling soon realizes that Gordon is actually Gum. And after seeing a moth fly past, she draws her weapon just as Gum disappears into his own basement. And Starling chases after him, discovering a screaming Catherine Martin in a dry well just before the lights in the basement go out, leaving her in complete darkness. And Gum stalks Starling in the dark with his night vision goggles and prepares to shoot her just when Starling, hearing the machinations of his revolver, swivels around and shoots Gum dead. And days later, at the FBI Academy graduation party, Starling receives a phone call from Dr. Lecter, who's apparently in the Bahamas. And as Lecter assures Starling that he has no plans to pursue her, he excuses himself from the phone call, remarking that he's having an old friend for dinner. And he hangs up the phone and follows Chilton, who is flanked by security through the streets of the village because he's now trying to run away from Dr. Lecter, whom he knows is after him. And that is how our beautiful movie comes to an end. Remember to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys on the next recap. Bye.